Victorian Literature, Charles Dickens, Part 1. The period of time we're going to look at is the Industrial Age. And this happened during the Victorian times, and the Queen at the time was Queen Victoria I. And we'll see that Dickens's life is closely linked to the Victorian age. The Industrial Revolution changed the way that we worked and made things in Britain. Previously, things had been made using natural means and using agriculture. And so the countryside had always played a big part in the way that we lived our lives. And so with the Industrial Revolution and steam-powered machines meant that we could make things faster and quicker. And this changed the whole landscape of Britain. In particular, what happened is that people moved away from the countryside and they moved to the cities where there were factories, because factories needed to be near water, but often they needed to be near places where there could be workers. And so you had more people arrive in the cities, and then more people, and then more people arrived. And so we had overpopulation in cities, and we had migration from the countryside to the cities. And so we had overcrowding in our cities, in particular London. And it got worse, as the only place where people could get jobs, and they were looking to find jobs, would be the cities and the factories. And so you had a large amount of people living in the cities near the factories so they could have a job and they could work. Okay, so let's have a look at Charles Dickens. So Charles Dickens, we know he wrote novels, but he didn't write novels in the way that we know of novels. So he didn't spend ages writing a book and then it was sold with all the chapters all together. In fact, the majority of his stories featured in newspapers, and his stories were told a couple of chapters at a time, and they'd be printed weekly in a newspaper. And sometimes his stories could go on for weeks, months, and years. So people would be buying the newspaper so they could see what happens next in the story. And it's a bit like how we've got soaps nowadays. Each episode carries on the story itself. Now, Dickens wrote the story as they were being published. So he hadn't got the ending finished, so he was writing to a deadline with these stories. So they were in newspapers, and the rich could buy the newspapers. The rich went to schools, and so they were able to read because they had money. The poor, maybe one or two people in the family could read. Not everybody could read because, you'd have to pay to go to school. So one person may read and they'd read the story out to people. And newspapers were not cheap, but people would have to give up something for them to be able to read a newspaper. And so usually a newspaper would be shared around families, with poor families. So the rich and the poor were able to read his stories. But also the rich were able to buy his stories when they were converted into books. And the rich could have books. They were very, very expensive to buy a book. So you'd probably find that in a poor family, they'd have a newspaper, whereas the rich would have newspapers and books. So looking at how Dickens wrote, because that changes the way that you write a story. So it's a storytelling in newspapers, bit by bit. And the word we use to describe that is serialized. Serialized storytelling. And that just means that you've broken the story up and you're telling it a bit over time. So we need to think about how that's going to affect memory, because if somebody told you a bit of a story one week and they told you another bit of the story the next week, we know you'll forget it. And that's normal. We forget things all the time, don't we? And so it's really important that Dickens had to write a story that would make sure people would remember. So what did he do to do that? Well, first of all, he made it clear who the villains were. And so as soon as you read his story, you could tell who the villains were and you could tell who the victims were. He made it really, really clear who the characters were. A bit like pantomime, when you watch a panto, you can see who the villains are and they're very, very clear. So when you read the story, you know straight away who's the baddie and who's the goodie. So he made sure we did that. He also made sure that there were people that we identify, whether they're rich, whether they're poor, whether they're young, whether they're old, so that if you read the story, you probably remember somebody that reminded you about yourself. And so he wrote the stories, so there were a number of different plot threads and strands that related to different people. So you'd probably remember that there was a teenager in the story, and you could remember that, identify with that person, and that's how you remembered the bit of the story. He'd also use humour, and so he'd give characters silly names, he'd also give silly things about characters, and he'd make sure there was something comical, so you knew who the comical characters were, and you'd remember them and go, ooh, this is the character with the silly name, or this is the character that's very, very silly. He'd also exaggerate things, so you'd remember the character with a big nose. And so as soon as you read the next chapter and the next bit in the serialized story, you'd remember, oh, it's the character with the big nose. I remember him. He's quite evil, isn't he? And so they remember the story. So it's all about making us remember. And what other way do we remember things? Well, we remember by repetition. So he'd repeat something once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. And often what Dickens had in his writing is he had a few little phrases that he'd use, so a character, and so you'd associate those words or phrases with that character. And then finally, he'd try and make something really dramatic, and he might end the story on a cliffhanger or something really, really dramatic. So he'd make sure his stories had all of those things. Remember, all those things are there to make sure we remember, because one week you'll remember it and then the next week you'll forget it. And so Dickens had to make sure that we remembered those stories. So quick little knowledge check for me. So I want to jot down your ideas to these questions. So 1, why did people leave the countryside? 2, what happened to the cities? 3, how are Dickens' stories read by most people? 4, what is the word we use to describe how they were read? 5, who read his books? 6, give 3 things Dickens did in his writing to ensure that people remembered the stories. Answer time now. Number 1, why did people leave the countryside? They left the countryside because of the money and because of jobs. The factories had created more jobs and the money was being taken away from the countryside and it was being moved towards the cities. 2, what happened to the cities? They became very, very overcrowded. 3, how were Dickens' stories read by most people? Newspapers. They were serialized in the newspapers. 4, what is the word we use to describe how they were read? Serialized. Number 5, who read his books? Young and old, rich and poor. 6, give 3 things Dickens did in his writing to ensure that people remembered the stories. He made clear heroes and villains. He included characters that people could relate to. He used humour. He used exaggeration. He used repetition. And he used dramatic events like cliffhangers at the end of chapters.